Jacobson is from the Emmanuel Synagogue in Woollahra. He was born in the United States and received his Bachelor of Arts in History and Spanish with college honours from the Washington University in St. Louis.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to the fellow speakers, and special thanks to everyone who's helped in organizing this conference here this afternoon. I have an opportunity, as Miriam said, to be last but not least. I face the challenge, I hope, of saying something new and adding something further to our conversation this afternoon. I want to start by focusing on really the foundation of environmental ethics in the Jewish tradition. Environmental justice has been a Jewish value for really the beginning of time, since the beginning of the Jewish people. I'm going to offer a number of quotes, a number of different texts from our tradition over thousands of years. But what I also want to do is, because I'm limited to having 10 minutes up here, is to say that the whole presentation will be available for you to view in full, including some of the notes that I have at the bottom of the presentation. So if I race through some of the slides, please know that you have an opportunity to look at the presentation later. We start with Genesis chapter 1, the Jewish view of God creating the world, that this creation is viewed as good, and that human beings are created in the image of God. But then we have a bit of a discrepancy and a bit of a challenge. Genesis chapter 1, 28 to 30 says, God blessed them and said to them, be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on the earth. I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food, and to all the animals on the land, I give all these green plants for you for food, and it was so. Now, this is a verse which creates a challenge to the notion of environmental ethics in Jewish tradition, because it says right there in this particular translation that you're supposed to fill the earth and master it. Now, we've heard about being stewards, we've heard about caring for the land. What do we do with this? Well, in Jewish tradition, we actually look at this and say that it's not about being a master. It's not about being and having utter and complete dominion and control, but it's about recognizing that humanity has the responsibility of governing the world with kindness and with fairness, and showing kindness and fairness to our fellow human beings, as well as to animals, as well as to all species, as well as to the environment. It's a misunderstanding to say the Jewish tradition says that this is dominion, whereas more so it's actually guardianship, a sense of protecting the world around us. And thus, what we find in Genesis chapter 2, a sense of man even being formed from the dust of the earth, from the Adamah in Hebrew, and that the sense of a man in Hebrew means Adam, the sense that we come actually from the ground and from the earth itself, and that the original man, Adam, was placed in the Garden of Eden to till it and to tend it, to look after it. So this notion of dominion or mastership is not dominion, it is a sense of caring and looking after the world itself. Thus, we are also part of the covenant, a sense of recognizing the partnership that we are in relation with God and maintaining and preserving the world. One of the most fundamental Jewish values is this sense in Hebrew of tikkun olam, which means repairing the world. And there's a prayer that's recited 3 times a day called the Aleinu. It's a prayer with which we conclude every single one of our services in the synagogue. And that contains 4 particular words in Hebrew that are recited 3 times a day. The taken olam b'malchut shaddai, that the obligation that comes in Jewish life is to perfect the world under the sovereignty of God. And thus there are other brilliant and beautiful principles from Jewish tradition suggesting the importance of righteousness and justice, of not being wasteful, of showing kindness to animals, and of recognizing that we are created in God's image. What particularly could that mean? There's a beautiful teaching from Midrash, rabbinic tradition, that says, what does it mean to actually be created in God's image? Well, perhaps the better question to ask is, how can man walk after God or imitate God's ways? What is meant is that man ought to emulate the attributes of God. If there is a belief that God clothes the naked, you shall clothe the naked too. If we believe that God visits the sick, you should visit the sick too. If you believe that God comforts the bereaved, so it's our responsibility to comfort the bereaved as well. If you believe that God is present when a loved one is buried, then so too shall you be involved in that kind of care of a loved one as well. So the sense is that if God is responsible for the environment, then human beings also have an ethical responsibility to care for the environment as well. This, however, becomes the challenge on the next slide, which is that in Jewish tradition we have the firm belief that We are given free will. In fact, I just yesterday celebrated the Jewish observance of Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. And it's a day to seek forgiveness, it's a day to confess our sins, it's a day to be together in community. It's a full 25-hour fast from sundown on Friday night to an hour after sundown. On Saturday we look and we're engaged in introspection. And I made a comment to someone earlier, I said, after that full day of introspection, now it's time to get back to business. And the business really revolves around the concept of free will in Jewish life. It's great that there are these principles for repairing the world, for righteousness and justice, for caring for animals, but ultimately it comes down to each of us. It comes down to the significant choices that we make and the choices that we make about our actions, and recognizing that our actions have a tremendous impact upon the world in which we live. There are many, many things that I can offer further about that notion of free will, but I'm going to move through very briefly a presentation that's offered by the Jewish Ecological Coalition in Melbourne, which is an organization that's listed in my footnotes at the end of the presentation, suggesting different kinds of what we call low-hanging fruit, if you will. Different things that it's possible for us to engage in, or different Jewish values that we can meditate and reflect upon, and recognize how we can transform those values and those texts into sacred action, into sacred duty. So next slide. First of all, focusing on energy. I'm going to go very, very quickly through this. So there's a consciousness of energy because there's a sense of recognizing the value of light, regarding electricity and the resources that we use and how we can be efficient in doing so. There's another teaching in regards to water, a beautiful text that comes from the book of Deuteronomy, which says that this is a passage that we read in the morning and the evening every day, Deuteronomy chapter 11. If you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving the Lord your God, and serving God with all your heart and soul, I will grant rain for your land in seasons, and the early rain and the late. You shall gather in your new grain and wine and oil. I will also provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and you shall eat your fill. But if you turn away, there will be no rain, and the ground will not yield its produce. You will soon perish from the good land that God has given you. Now, this is a challenge to many contemporary Jews, because they say, well, if that's what the traditional view of God is, then, well, let's kind of put that view off to the side. But there's another way of viewing the text, which is to say, well, if we are actually stewards of this land, if we are actually supposed to care for the world around us, then our use of our resources, or our abuse of our resources, will make a significant difference and a significant impact on the world around us. We can offer, I'm just going to run very quickly through the slides because I have 1 minute to go. We can offer explanations about transport, about not being wasteful. There's a sense in the following slide about purchasing and about recognizing or going beyond our means. A beautiful text from the 3rd century which says, who is wise? He who learns from every person. Who is rich? He who is happy with his lot. A sense of recognizing this sense of inner peace in ourselves, and understanding that we don't actually need more, that there's a significant difference between needing something and wanting something. I'm going to go very, very, very quickly right to the end of the presentation to just offer another perspective. This is a slide that says Contemporary Efforts #1, a principle of eco-kashrut. In Jewish tradition, we have this large collection of principles about kashrut that relate to ethical eating, that refer to every time that we engage with our environment as well. Now, we need to have, as one rabbi puts it, a broader sense of good practice in everyday life that draws on the deep well springs of Jewish wisdom and tradition about the relationships between human beings and the earth. The way that we live, on the next slide, and the choices we make have a direct impact on the earth. If we take small steps towards living in a more sustainable way, then as a community, our combined efforts can make a difference. And I close with a beautiful quote from the 3rd century, a text known as Pirkei Avot, which is one of the earliest rabbinic teachings. And it says, you are not required to complete the task, but you're not free to withdraw from it. So perhaps if all of us are to continue to engage in this beautiful task, we can continue to make a difference.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you particularly for that insight about the importance of free will and freedom to respond to our ethical teachings and how we live every day.